A 14-year-old girl walks into a bank to deposit her scholarship check, but ends up being treated like a criminal. What no one knows is that she's not just carrying money. She's carrying the truth that could bring down an entire system, and she won't stay silent. On Monday morning, the fresh air of the quiet neighborhood seemed to enhance the meticulousness in every step of 14-year-old Madison Porter. Her neatly pressed school blazer, polished black leather shoes, and the folder clutched tightly in her hand, all of it signaled that today was an important day, not only because Madison was about to visit the bank to conduct her first-ever transaction with a $5,000 scholarship check, but also because this was a milestone marking the maturity she had worked so hard to achieve over the years. Madison didn't come from a struggling family. Her mother, Dr. Evelyn Porter, was a respected financial expert who had always taught her daughter that value didn't come from wealth, but from independence and integrity. So today, Evelyn didn't accompany her. She let Madison go alone, as a gesture of trust and empowerment. Before leaving the house, she only asked softly, "Are you sure you want to do this on your own?" Madison smiled, her eyes clear yet brimming with determination. "I'm ready, Mom." Oakdank was renowned for its professionalism and courtesy, but as soon as Madison stepped through the large glass doors, she sensed something wasn't quite as she had imagined. When she approached the counter, explained her purpose, and presented her documents, the manager shifted her expression. Gone was the warm smile Madison had seen just moments earlier when a middle-aged white customer had walked in. "Little girl, a check this big, it's yours?" Catherine asked, her tone hovering with skepticism. Madison nodded slightly, handing over the scholarship confirmation letter, her student ID, and a copy of her grades. "It's all here," she said, her voice steady despite the effort. Yet professionalism didn't extend to her. Suspicious glances, a cold tone, sideways looks from the surrounding staff. Invisibly, Madison was pushed out of the normal flow of transaction. No one smiled anymore. No one explained. There was only prolonged waiting and a sense of isolation, as if she had done something wrong. Amid the bank's luxurious and glamorous design, Madison realized this wasn't just a transaction. It was a test, and perhaps the beginning of a confrontation she hadn't prepared for. Madison stood there, silent, polite, and utterly invisible. At first, she tried to reassure herself. Maybe they were just being thorough. Maybe verifying a scholarship check was standard procedure. But then she saw it, and every excuse in her mind crumbled. Just a few steps away, an older man, white, silver-haired, dressed in a light gray suit, walked in. He didn't line up, he didn't wait, and most strikingly, he wasn't questioned at all. Catherine Hayes, the bank manager who had brushed past Madison with a cold glance, immediately stepped out from behind the counter as if pre-programmed. Her smile bloomed, warm and welcoming, so much so that even Madison felt suffocated. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison. Let me handle your paperwork personally," Catherine said, her tone dipping into one of deep respect. No ID check, no holding the check up to the light, no verification required. In less than 3 minutes, a transaction worth tens of thousands of dollars was completed, accompanied by a repeated "Have a wonderful day" that sounded like a pre-recorded song. Madison froze. Her heart pounded heavily, blood rushing to her face as if she'd been slapped. She didn't know exactly how much longer she waited, but every second after that moment was a small, silent cut. No one explained why her check still hadn't been processed. No one asked if she needed help. There were only furtive glances, whispers behind her back, and the raw feeling that she wasn't welcome here. Another customer walked in, a South Asian man with neatly parted black hair clutching a stack of documents. When he approached the counter, Catherine reappeared, this time without a smile. Just one curt sentence. "The system's slow. You'll have to come back later." Madison held her breath. By now there was no mistaking it, no room for doubt. What was happening wasn't a coincidence. It had its own logic. A silent, ruthless, and all too familiar logic. Selection based on appearance, on skin color, on prejudice. Anger flared in her chest, but Madison stayed still. She bit her lip lightly to hold it in. She didn't want to cry, didn't want to tremble. She wanted to remember, to etch every second of this into her memory. Not because she was weak, but because she needed a reason to fight. And now they had just handed her one. Raw and bitter, just like the glance Catherine had cast her way. Madison was told to step aside. No chair, no explanation, just a cold nod from Catherine Hayes and a pointed gesture from the tall security guard stationed near the entrance. She moved slowly, her shoulders tense, the sound of her shoe soles echoing on the cold marble floor with each step, as if she herself were the disturbance in this silent space. A small corner at the far end of the bank. No nameplate, no sign reading pending transactions. Just an empty space and exposure. From where she stood, Madison could see everyone. But more importantly, everyone could see her. Fleeting glances brushed past her, lingering just long enough for her to know they were judging, wondering, whispering. She didn't need to hear the words to guess what they were thinking. No one approached her, no one asked what was happening. Madison gripped her folder tightly, her fingers slick with sweat. More than 20 minutes had passed since she handed over her check and documents. No one had told her how long it would take. No one asked if she needed to call a family member. She'd made it clear she didn't have a phone with her. No response. The corner where she stood seemed to shrink with every passing minute. Her breathing grew quicker, not out of fear, but out of anger. Rage that caught in her throat. Right now she was no different from an unconvicted criminal, punished simply for daring to show up in a place not deemed hers. The guard's hand rested firmly on his belt, where a glossy black radio hung. He didn't say a word, but his eyes never left her. That gaze wasn't protective, it was oppressive, watchful, wary. Madison stared back at him, forcing herself not to blink. She hadn't done anything wrong. She owed no one an apology. And though her throat was dry, though her heart pounded in her chest, she kept her back straight, her shoulders unbowed. Silent defiance was a strength Madison had learned from her mother. No need to shout, no need to cause a scene, just refuse to break. A bank employee passed by, glanced at her, then looked away. No one wanted to get involved. Madison let out a faint, crooked smile. They didn't need to yell in her face that she wasn't welcome. It was already painfully clear in every gesture, every step, every wordless look. She felt like a stain on the pristine picture this bank was trying to paint. And in the midst of that deafening silence, Madison didn't cry. She didn't beg. She didn't leave. She stood there, like a rock, not because she didn't feel the pain, but because she was too used to people only believing when you refused to back down. Madison remained there like a patient shadow, forgotten. But in that silence, she wasn't still inside. Her heart beat steadily, yet her eyes moved constantly, observing, memorizing, analyzing. From the dim corner of the room, she caught sight of Catherine Hayes speaking with a stranger. He was tall, sunglasses perched on his head, dressed impeccably, but his expression was too calm to belong to an ordinary customer. Madison narrowed her eyes. Catherine leaned in close to him, her hand swiftly slipping a thin stack of documents into his grasp. It happened so quietly that hardly anyone would notice. Since she was little, Madison had a habit of observing and remembering what others overlooked. Small movements, averted glances, details that didn't quite fit. It was what had earned her the scholarship, and it was what would protect her today. In her worn crossbody bag, she carried an inseparable companion. A small brown leather notebook, the kind no one noticed, no one cared about. But for Madison, it was a vault of truth. She quietly unzipped the bag, her fingers brushing the notebook's edge before pulling out a fine-tipped pen, sharp as a blade. No one paid attention. She'd chosen the perfect moment. All eyes were on a new customer who just walked through the main entrance, a white-tailed gentleman in a designer suit. Catherine immediately turned to greet him, her professional smile blooming as if nothing had happened. Madison seized the chance. Time, 10:47 a.m. Location, Whitestone Bank, downtown branch. Observation, suspicious transaction between branch manager Catherine Hayes and an unidentified individual. Item exchanged, manila folder, labeled confidential. Bit familiar. Not their first time. Context. No formal transaction confirmation, no entry into the system, no acknowledgement in front of other staff. Madison wrote quickly, the ink never smudging. Her hand didn't tremble. Each stroke carried the weight of truth, a truth she couldn't yet prove but knew was there. She looked up, her expression blank, though the corner of her mouth twitched faintly. In the distance, Catherine shot her a quick glance, a fleeting look as if confirming something. Madison didn't blink, didn't flinch. She was used to staying on guard. She closed the notebook, tucked the pen away, and hid it beneath her scholarship documents. No one saw a thing, but everything was recorded, detailed, cold, and enough to serve as evidence if needed. She had no power, no status, but she had her memory, her observation, and now information. She knew she was playing a game the others didn't even realize she'd joined. The sharp clack of Catherine's high heels echoed on the granite floor. Each step struck like a hammer against Madison's chest, firm, cold, and leaving no room to breathe. She tried to hold her position in the shadowed corner behind a stone pillar, near the slightly ajar door of the office where Catherine had just entered with the stranger. Madison knew she shouldn't be here, but her feet refused to move. Her heart pounded in her chest, beating like a war drum. Something wasn't right, and she could feel it with piercing clarity. In the stillness, even the faintest whisper stood out. A man's voice, low and dry, carried a hint of mockery. "You know what you're doing, don't you, Catherine?" A pause. Then Catherine's voice cut through, sharp, hissing through gritted teeth. "I've done my part. You need to transfer the money as promised. Now." Madison held her breath. Her fingers gripped the pillar tightly, knuckles whitening. "You're too impatient, Catherine. It's just a few documents, after all. It's Naomi Porter's financial plan. Do you get it? Her entire merger strategy. It's all there. If you don't act soon, the parent company will find out I accessed internal data." Madison's heart jolted. Naomi Porter. Her mother. Her hand loosened from the pillar as if the entire world had just tilted off its axis. The man let out a soft chuckle, but the sound was like nails scraping across the taut glass of truth. "We'll handle it. But you should remember, if this gets out, I don't exist. You'll be the only one who pays." "I know," Catherine whispered, but there was no trace of fear. Instead, her tone was chillingly cold. Madison swallowed hard, her eyes wide. She felt like she was hearing the end of a play she'd thought she was merely watching, only to realize she'd been thrust onto the stage without warning. Her legs began to tremble. But inside, something was rising. Not tears, not weakness. A deep, searing anger, blended with a fierce awakening. This wasn't personal anymore. It wasn't just about a girl humiliated for her skin color or age. This was a conspiracy, a betrayal, a direct attack on the person she loved most in the world, her mother. She took a small step back, preparing to slip away before she was spotted. But just then the office doors swung open. Madison pressed her back against the pillar, her heart seeming to stop. The man emerged first, his strides slow, a gray coat draped carelessly over his shoulder. Catherine followed, her face restored to its usual calm, artificial and razor-sharp. They didn't notice her. She waited a few more seconds. When both had disappeared down the hallway, Madison stepped out, her breathing still heavy. She knew she'd just traded her safety for something bigger, but now there was no turning back. She had to act. And this time, she wouldn't just stand there taking notes. The air in the bank lobby thickened as Madison retreated to her spot, her heart still racing from the conversation she'd unwittingly overheard. But before she could steady her breathing, Catherine's gaze sliced toward her like a cold, sharp blade. That look, it wasn't the usual dismissive chill, it was something else. Fear masked as authority. Catherine strode toward the counter, whispering something to a nearby security guard. Madison couldn't make out the words, but within seconds a tall man with a face hard as stone approached her. "Come with me." His voice was dry, emotionless, but carried an undeniable command. Madison flinched, her feet instinctively stepping back. "I'm just waiting for my transaction to be confirmed," she replied, keeping her tone steady despite the dryness in her throat. "The manager wants a private word. Please come to the back room." Madison glanced at Catherine, who now stood behind the counter, arms crossed, tracking her every move as if tightening a net around her prey. Her heart pounded. She knew that if she followed, that door might be the curtain closing on any chance to resist. A sealed room. No cameras, no witnesses, no one on her side. The thought made the air around her feel suffocating, as if oxygen were running out. But in that moment, she caught sight of the leather notebook in her hand, and the name Harrison Wells scrawled hastily, bold on the page she'd just written. She still held evidence, she still held the upper hand, if she could play it right. "I want to call my mom first," she said, her voice strangely calm. "It's my right, I'm a minor." The guard hesitated, caught off guard. He hadn't expected the girl to speak with such certainty, but he pressed on, his tone firm. "Phones aren't allowed in that area. The manager will explain." "Then I'm not going," Madison replied, her gaze unwavering. "If necessary, I'll ask an adult to intervene." She didn't shout, didn't panic, but something in her eyes made the guard pause. An uncanny calm for a child, as if she knew something the adults didn't yet grasp. Catherine stepped forward, her voice sharp and shrill. "You're causing a scene, Madison. If you don't cooperate, I'll have to call the police." Madison didn't blink. "Then I'll tell them everything. About the confidential envelope you just handed to Harrison Wells." The room shattered into a second of deadly silence. Catherine's face paled. She hadn't realized Madison had overheard. Madison held her stare. She didn't know how far she could push this choice, but she knew this was the first step. She was no longer the girl confined to a corner, no longer the one waiting to be dealt with. She was the one who had just started a fight, and this time, Catherine Hayes wasn't the one in control. The overhead lights of the bank glimmered off the marble floor, cold and indifferent, mirroring the atmosphere enveloping Madison. She stood rooted to her spot, eyes wide and alert, her back against the white wall under the scrutiny of the security guard's gaze. From this distance, she could survey the entire transaction area, a stage where roles were pre-assigned. Who was welcomed, who was ignored, who was excluded. Then, everything shifted as the glass door beside the VIP room swung open. A man stepped in, tall, clad in a perfectly tailored gray coat, a dark tie knotted tightly, each step carrying weight. His face was sharp and cold, his deep, decisive eyes cutting like a knife. He needed no introduction. Madison knew his name. Harrison Wells, CEO of Meridian Banking Group, her mother's sworn enemy. Madison held her breath. Catherine Hayes emerged from behind the counter, a practiced smile sliding across her lips, smooth as silk, though her eyes glinted with calculation. No lengthy greetings, no cumbersome formalities. She guided Harrison to a secluded corner near the stairwell, where the cameras couldn't fully reach. Madison tilted her head. She shifted a few inches, positioning herself behind a marble pillar. The moment unfolded in a few heartbeats. Catherine opened her black handbag, pulling out a thick, dark brown folder secured with a large metal clip. On the cover, Madison caught a glimpse of bold, embossed text in black ink. Confidential, internal audit report, internal documents. Catherine didn't hesitate. Her hand passed the folder to Harrison with a fluid motion, as if handing over something familiar. No verification, no receipt, as though this were a transaction scripted long ago. Harrison glanced at the cover, then gave a curt nod. Brief, cold as a verdict. His face bore no trace of a smile, but satisfaction was evident. For a fleeting moment, Harrison's gaze swept sideways, locking onto Madison. Her heart clenched. He didn't pause, his expression didn't shift, but his other hand swiftly tucked the folder into his leather briefcase. The movement was seamless, like that of a seasoned dealer. They exchanged a few words, short, clipped, barely audible. Just lips moving and eyes sharing an unspoken understanding. Catherine nodded one final time, clasping her hands behind her back like a servant who'd completed her task. Harrison adjusted his collar and turned to leave the bank. His footsteps struck the stone floor, each one ringing out clearly, like a countdown to an impending explosion. Madison swallowed hard. She hadn't heard their words, but she had seen the folder, the word confidential, Catherine's face, the shameless calm in her eyes as she betrayed the bank, and possibly Madison's mother. There was no doubt left. Catherine wasn't just prejudiced, wasn't just biased. She was a traitor. And Madison, in her school uniform, dusty shoes, notebook in hand, was the only one who had witnessed it. I stood there, rigid. My spine felt fused to the wall behind me, my eyes still tracking Catherine Hayes as if looking away for even a second would make the truth I'd just witnessed vanish like a mirage. Inside me something was screaming, but no sound escaped. It was still that silence. The same frigid silence that had enveloped me from the moment I stepped into this bank. I'd been polite, had presented all my documents. I'd waited for hours. I'd tried to hold back, swallowing every word I wanted to say, standing tall as my mother had taught me. The more they look down on you, the higher you hold your head. But my head, though raised, was still looked down upon. They didn't see me. None of them truly saw me. A black girl in a school uniform, holding a $5,000 scholarship. They didn't see my grades. They didn't see my effort. They didn't see my pride. They only saw a problem. I'm not the problem. I'm not the troublemaker. I'm a 14-year-old girl who came to the bank to deposit a piece of her future, but they made me feel like I was trying to do something wrong, as if my very presence here tainted the air they breathed. Catherine's gaze swept over me like I was an annoying smudge on a glass door. Her voice barked an order to the guard. "Keep an eye on that girl. Don't let her cause trouble." That girl? Cause trouble? What had I done wrong? I hadn't shouted, hadn't cried, hadn't run, hadn't questioned. I stood still like a statue, quietly enduring the scornful looks, the mocking words, the isolation. I thought that would make them reconsider. It didn't. They didn't need a reason not to trust me. My existence alone was enough for them to doubt, to exclude, to strip me of dignity and dismiss my presence. I'm not the problem. I'm a girl with a name, a family, and self-respect. I'm Madison Porter. I'm the daughter of the woman who built this bank from nothing. I'm the product of late night studying, of exams I passed not through privilege but through intellect and will. I'm not an accident, and I'm not someone who'll stay silent forever. In this moment, in this cold, prejudice-filled room, I won't let them define me by my silence any longer. I took a deep breath. My chest heaved. My hand tightened around the notebook at my side as if it were my sword, a reminder that I was still fighting. I'm not the problem. I'm the answer to the rot they're hiding. And it's time I spoke up. When my mother walked in, the space seemed to crack open. It wasn't the echo of her high heels reverberating through the bank lobby, nor the expensive dark coat she wore. It was her presence, steady as a mountain, and her eyes, which, when they found me, lit a fire in my chest. I trembled, not from fear, but because at last someone saw me. She didn't shout. She didn't fuss with question. She simply stood in front of me, her back to Catherine, and gently placed a hand on my shoulder. That single touch lifted me from the invisible pit I'd been falling into all morning, unable to stop. "Are you okay, Madison?" she asked, her voice soft yet firm as steel. I nodded, but tears had already spilled over, not from weakness, but from holding on too long, too hard. Then I pulled out my notebook. I opened it in front neater. I read every line, every detail, Every scornful remark, every moment of being dismissed, and the secret meeting I'd stumbled upon, the one that could threaten her entire career. She didn't interrupt me. She let me finish, and when I stopped, she stayed silent for a long moment. "You did the right thing," she said, "and more than that, you were brave." I looked at her. I just didn't want to give up. I didn't want them to think I'd break easily. She knelt down, placing both hands on my shoulders, gazing into my eyes. A look so tender, yet so powerful it overwhelmed me. "Madison, today you faced something unfair, and I wish you didn't have to grow up through experiences like this. But you did what not everyone dares to do. You chose to stand up, not just for yourself, but for those who come after you." I felt my heart beat differently. Something awakened. "This isn't just about a rejected check anymore, sweetheart," she continued. "This is about how a system operates and how a new generation can change it. You've started that with your own voice." I glanced around. The customers who'd once turned away in silence were now looking at us. Some eyes held shame, some held admiration. In me, I saw a path opening before me. I'd never thought of myself as someone who could spark change. I was just a 14-year-old student with a notebook and unshaken self-respect. But maybe that's exactly how revolutions begin. I gripped my notebook tighter. It felt heavier, not from the paper, but from the meaning it now carried. It wasn't just a tool for notes anymore. It was a testimony, evidence, a torch. I didn't just come here to deposit a scholarship today. I found a purpose bigger than myself. I am Madison Porter, and I will not stay silent. The bank doors swung open. The decisive click of high heels echoed on the cold stone floor. The air seemed to freeze as my mother, Natali Porter, stepped inside. She was no longer just a mother. She was a CEO, a warrior, the embodiment of an undeniable truth. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her presence was enough. Manager Catherine Hayes straightened up instantly, her face paling as she recognized who had entered. "Mrs. Porter, I didn't know." "You didn't need to," my mother said, her voice like a verdict. "I'm here to hear my daughter recount what happened in this place, and then I'll be the one to speak." I stood beside her, handing her my notebook. No hesitation, no fear. Now every line I'd written was no longer a solitary act of defiance. It was the truth, a voice being heard. I read aloud, to everyone, the discriminatory remarks, the cold behavior, the suspicious glares, the whispered gossip. I recounted the secret exchange, the folder marked confidential, the covert handshake with my mother's competitor. Each word sliced through the glossy facade Catherine had draped herself in. The bank fell deathly silent. My mother turned to Catherine. "You didn't just humiliate a customer. You betrayed this place, a place that trusted you enough to hand you the keys to its honor. And worse, you belittled a child who dared to walk in here with intelligence and dignity." Catherine stammered, but my mother didn't give her a chance. "You're fired." Right here, right now, a murmur rippled through the room. But it wasn't dissent. It was agreement. At that moment, the security guard stepped forward, no longer escorting me like a criminal, but leading Catherine away like the traitor she was. My mother turned to me, resting a hand on my shoulder. "You don't need to do anything more. You've done the right thing, not just for yourself, but for everyone who's ever been treated like they don't belong." I looked around, at the stunned gazes, the awakened eyes, and I understood. We don't need to shout for justice. We just need to stand firm and speak the truth. That day, I didn't just reclaim my dignity. I opened a door for change. My name is Madison Porter, and I belong here as much as anyone else. Her story leaves us speechless because of the injustice, the courage, and the unwavering belief in justice. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this journey. If this story touched you, please share it. Hit like and subscribe to Millionaire and Heart Stories to support us in creating more videos every day.